coming up on the States, powered by the Center Square. Military operations ramp up in Iran, but end in Iraq. We'll get the very latest from the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief, Sarah Roderick Fitch, on U.S. military action overseas, how much it might be costing the Iranian economy, how much it might cost U.S. taxpayers, and how much it could cost to travel the Strait of Hormuz. We'll have everyday economics. What's the impact of the Federal Reserve, at least for now, not cutting interest rates? America's talking about Medicaid fraud, including a big case in North Carolina. There's a proposal to expand maritime boundaries in Gulf Coast states, potentially generating billions of dollars in tax revenues. A crackdown on birth tourism in Texas, and 15 states sue the federal government over funding cuts to mental health grants. Welcome to the States, powered by the Center Square. I'm Jim Talamonte, sitting in for Greg Bishop on this Wednesday, July 15th. Now, President Trump announced earlier this week that the U.S. would reinstate a naval blockade on Iranian ports. So let's get the very latest on what's happening in the Middle East with the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief. We're very privileged to be joined by Sarah Roderick Fitch. Sarah, thank you for taking a few minutes of your very busy time. And I know you have a new update today at thecentersquare.com on the very latest military action in Iran, while the Iranians, it appears, have attacked commercial ships. What can you tell us that's the very latest on this story?
Yes, they are continuing attacking. They don't seem to be backing down from attacking these commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. From different accounts coming from the Iranians maintain that the Strait of Hormuz is closed. However, the United States is saying it's open, and the U.S. is enforcing a blockade that it reinstated after being removed in June following the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. Now, this blockade, it's pretty costly, and that was one of the big points for the Iranian economy. The Trump administration estimates it costs the Iranian economy somewhere between $400 and $500 million a day, which is pretty significant, meaning that they've got to pay for these weapons. They have to pay the IRGC members, all these people. And really the idea is to sort of choke the Iranian regime and trying to bring them to the table. But it doesn't seem to be the president saying, okay, they've called him up, they're wanting to make a deal. At the same time, he's saying they're lying. They've shown sort of a two-faced sort of way of doing things back and forth. And so it's really interesting where things are going. But it looks like the president is just frustrated with what is happening with Iran. He has given them so much opportunity. He's talked about that. He said he's accused them of lying. And going back on some of their words, especially like the MOU that had been one of the big things with the MOU, in fact, was that the Iranians had to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And obviously that is not happening. So that's why we're here. And these strikes, and there was another one early in the morning. So this is unusual, because usually the U.S. lately in the past week has been striking in the evenings, but this shows really sort of like, is this signaling, full on military operations, sort of returning to that that April, between January and April, that whole, February. I was thinking of Venezuela, February, the end of February. Really, there was about 6 weeks there. So is this returning to that? And it kind of looks like it is going in that direction.
And the president said, and of course you've been there in the White House, to not only, so you've been seeing his reaction, you can see what's on his face, you've been covering him long enough to know beyond the words. And so now he said earlier this week that the U.S. would be the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz and could impose a fee on cargo transiting that waterway. What's the latest on that potential fee, or could that happen if the U.S. were to have control there?
Well, he appears to be backing down from that. Yesterday, he hosted the Iraqi prime minister in the Oval Office, and he kind of backed down from that, saying that there was a lot of pushback from some of the countries in the region. And so he said that basically what he was planning on doing was, I guess, some of these countries, and he was meaning, I think, more like some of these Gulf neighbors that are there, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, some of those countries that really are obviously relying on the Strait of Hormuz have offered investments in the United States. So as some way to give back, I guess, to taxpayers. And so there really hasn't, other than the president saying that, there really hasn't been a whole lot of details as far as those deals go, but he's just saying that that is what they're going to do. So he's sort of backing off from that idea. Of course, it has been said, hey, there's not going to be any fees, going through. But obviously the taxpayers, the American taxpayers are paying, could be paying a lot of money for these military operations to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, especially these latest rounds of strikes have been really sort of focusing on those coastal areas. There's missile sites, drone sites, all those places that are targeting ships within the Strait of Hormuz.
And we're talking to Sarah Roderick-Fitch, the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square, covering the White House, federal government activities, the president, and we're talking about what's happening in Iran, but also, as you've covered, the story regarding Iraq. And I think a number of Americans thought, wait a minute, that war ended, but there were still U.S. military operations in Iraq. And Sarah, we're going to hear from the president first, but let's hear what the president had to say after he and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth met with the Iraqi prime minister this week and announced the end of American operations in Iraq. This is President Donald Trump.
Well, we don't think we need the military there anymore. It's a very a big operation. And what we do have is the oil companies are all going in now, and they're doing partnerships with Iraq, and they're getting along very well. The relationship is a whole big relationship where we don't need the military there. We're there to help them. We're there to protect them if need be. But we don't think that's going to be necessary. And their primary, I consider an opponent. They might have considered a friend, but I consider that an opponent was Iran, was a big burden on Iraq because they were the bully of the Middle East, as you know. And we were just talking about that. But they're not going to have that problem anymore because Iran has been very much destabilized, and really their military power is just a tiny fraction of what it was just 4 months ago. So they're not going to have that problem. I think it's really, in a sense, it's given them freedom to do what they have to do. And I think that's one of the reasons that our oil companies are going in there at levels that have never been seen before.
So that's the president with the Iraqi prime minister. And Sarah, the president seemed to suggest that, although the as you mentioned, the taxpayer bill for Iran is rising, there could potentially be some economic benefit finally coming out of Iraq if, as he says, the oil companies are going in there like never before.
Yes, we'll see about that. One of the things I think was interesting was I was not there at the meeting at the White House, and I attended the meeting. I was in there with remarks at the Pentagon with Secretary Hegseth and the Prime Minister. And I think what was interesting, what is not really been talked about, yes, we're talking about the oil, is sort of, there's more possibility there. But also I think is sort of the shift really is what the president was really trying to get at. And I think that Secretary Hegseth really, he clearly laid out at the Pentagon was basically this operation that was ongoing in Iraq. People often think of going back to the early 2000s when we were first there. This was more based on, this was the fight against ISIS that was going on in Syria and Iraq. So this has been really happening since 2014, and pulling out of there. And what Secretary Hegseth said was that the U.S., they're done with operations in Iraq, but they want to shift the focus to Iran and its proxies. So we're talking Hamas, Hezbollah, was the number ones, Houthis, those organizations, those other organizations throughout the Middle East, and what they're doing. So it'd be really, I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see how this shift happens. Does this mean where those troops that are stationed currently in Iraq, where will they be going? Will there be shifts at other bases in the Middle East? Does that open the door for ground operations? The president has mentioned the possibility he will not rule out taking over Karg Island, which is a huge point. That's where the Iranian oil, that's where most of their oil and stuff like that's their huge port there. It is very strategic for them. And it's sort of seen, I guess you could say, as maybe the Iwo Jima of this conflict at this point. So it'll be really interesting to see if that's kind of what they're sort of transitioning. But really, it's closing one door, opening another door at this point. But that's what it signifies.
And Sarah, you're not going to be any less busy because with these strikes now happening at different times of day, it's like you're on the clock all the time, isn't it? So there's probably no break for you anytime soon, is there?
No. But it's very interesting to watch. It'll be interesting to see if these talks resume. There might be another ceasefire. We'll see how long that lasts. And it's just interesting what the president has said in the past. He's called them liars. Will it be different this time? We'll see.
And the president is scheduled to address the nation Thursday night. But are we expecting anything on the Iran front, or is this going to be more focused on elections, or do we know? I guess you never really know. But what are you hearing?
He is saying he won't be. He's not telling us. He's only disclosing a little bit. Definitely, elections are part of that. I think part of the push to get the SAVE Act is a big part of that. But I think that there could be some portions in there about Iran. I can't help but think that there won't be. But he's being very tight-lipped. He has indicated a little bit. He said there's going to be a very large announcement. We don't know what that is. We just do know that there's going to be elections talked about. It's 9 p.m., which is prime time for the country. So it would be certain. It wouldn't be unusual for him to bring up the latest sort of Iranian conflict. This is an opportunity to update Americans on what is happening over there, especially if he is planning to sort of ramp up these operations and give them a rundown, just kind of like his past address, and really sort of to address the nation on the economic status, gas prices, energy prices, all of that, which is hurting Americans at the pumps. So this would be an excellent opportunity, I think, really to sort of make his case, especially as we're sort of we're coming into the midterm season here, because in August, that's when Congress, they recess. And many of them are hitting the campaign trails, as I'm sure the president will be doing the same. There's a lot of state fairs going on. It's a great opportunity. So here's a great opportunity before they leave to make that sort of that push and sort of make that case with the American people on the SAVE Act, possibly the Iranian conflict, anything else that the president has on his agenda, really.
Sarah, I know you'll be keeping us posted on all of that at thecentersquare.com. Thank you for your award-winning coverage, and thank you for joining us and sharing some of your busy time. And I know it's getting busier with the president's speech and, of course, everything going on overseas. Sarah Roderick-Fitch, the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square, joining us here on the States. I'm Jim Talamonte, in for Greg Bishop. There's a lot more to come. Everyday economics and America's Talking on the States, powered by the Center Square. Welcome back to the States. I'm Jim Talamonte, in for Greg Bishop. Thanks to Sam and Eliana for keeping the guest host on track today. Greg's back next week. Let's talk money. The Federal Reserve is not cutting interest rates, at least not for now. But the Center Square's publisher, Chris Krug, has more on this in our Everyday Economics segment with PhD economist Orphe Divounguy on the States.
Oh, prices look like they finally peaked, but you pulled your own bet on a rate cut this year. Tariffs, deficits, fading housing tailwind. they're all pushing the wrong way. And here's why the Fed can't afford to wait. Dr. O, you just wrote that even if the energy shock fades, you no longer expect a rate cut this year. And that's a change from where you were. In plain terms, what did you see that took the cut off the table for you?
Yeah, look, I became less confident that inflation's heading back to 2%, right? So we had talked about this on this show many times, maybe 3% is the new 2%.
Yep.
And maybe we'll get back to 2%, but I don't think quickly enough to justify a rate cut, at least not in 2026. There are three things working against the Fed. First, tariffs. Nearly half of businesses that pay tariffs say they still expect to raise prices further. That tells me the tariff shock is not yet fully behind us. It hasn't worked itself through the economy. And so for a small business, the process is straightforward, right? Your supplier raises your cost. You can absorb that cost and accept a smaller profit margin, or you cut expenses somewhere else, or you raise prices. And a lot of businesses are raising prices. Second, housing. Housing had been quietly helping bring down inflation. Market rents had cooled substantially, right? Rent growth had cooled substantially after the Fed. So remember, market rents in 2022 peaked at 16% year-over-year increases, which was absolutely crazy, right? That's back down to about 2% on a year-over-year basis. But CPI measures rents paid across millions of existing leases, not just what's on the market today. It takes a little bit of time for lower market rents to work through the CPI calculation, the official inflation, housing inflation statistics. And that process is happening, right? The problem is that when you look at market rents today, they're no longer slowing. In fact, on a year-over-year basis, they're firming up. You start to see an increase in rent growth. Fewer new apartments are, coming on the market. So that's kind of alleviating that downward pressure that we had on rents. Vacancy rates are no longer climbing. And so that means rent growth is going to accelerate. And if rent growth begins to accelerate, then we're not going to see more disinflation in the CPI. Third, fiscal policy. I think that's the part that I think people don't pay enough attention to. The federal government continues to run larger and larger deficits that will support demand, right? Government spending supports aggregate demand. At the same time as the Fed may be trying to kind of keep demand in check because of the inflation at 4% right now. So I no longer think the Fed will have enough confidence in the inflation outlook to cut rates in 2026, right? For the reasons that I highlighted. Of course, there's one more reason that you might hear about in the news, the AI spending. All of that spending is fueling the demand side of the economy.
So there is a divide inside of the Fed, right? I mean, there's 9 who have indicated that they'd like a hike before the end of the year. That's half the committee, leaning that way. And then the other half of the committee, is maybe signaling like too soon to tell. June hiring came in at just 57,000 jobs. That's half of what it was, the prior month. If the job market's softening, why does it make it easier for the Fed to sit still rather than harder?
Yeah, look, the labor market is stuck, right? It's no longer deteriorating and it's not accelerating either, right? And I think that's the important distinction, right? We're stuck at this level, and at this level, the unemployment rate is really low. A lot of the big reason why the unemployment rate is low is because the labor force has actually been declining, right? The size of our labor force has been declining. Also, there are fewer foreign workers who tend to have a higher rate of participation than, native-born Americans. And so that also plays a role in explaining why labor force participation rates are lower. and why the unemployment rate has not moved higher, right? And so that is kind of where we are. And at such a low unemployment rate, and with fewer workers in the economy, there is a risk that wage growth could actually begin to accelerate. And so as a result, the Fed has really no reason to use the labor market the Fed shouldn't use the labor market as a reason to cut interest rates. The labor market is tight and could get tighter, not because businesses are hiring in droves, but because there's just not enough workers in this economy, and our labor force is shrinking. So that is the reason why we can't use the labor market. In fact, most FOMC members are now somewhat focused on the inflation picture. The focus is shifted to inflation. Is inflation going to come down, given all the forces that I just highlighted earlier?
Yeah, we've got CPI. We're taping this on Monday. We have CPI coming out on Tuesday, so we'll talk about that in a bit. So let me close with this question. So if the path back to 2% just got longer and a little bumpier, call it living with 3% for a while, if we can get to 3%, what does that actually cost a regular family that's been waiting for rates to come down?
Yeah, it means interest rates remain elevated. Right. It means basically, your credit card rates are not going to come down. Mortgage rates are not going to come down. And so that I think corporate borrowing costs are going to stay elevated. Right. If you need a loan to finance a business or business activity, well, that rate is going to stay elevated. And I think, and we should do an episode on it. I think one of the major reasons for this, is not just the shocks, right, that we've had, right, with the Middle East crisis. Those are supply shocks. Right. But on the demand side, there's a federal government that is the largest borrower in this economy. And that federal government finances deficits by issuing treasury debt. And, as the demand, as all of that supply of debt increases, and investors are not able to absorb all that debt, right? Interest rates go up, right? The yields on treasuries go up, and those yields, right? The 10-year treasury yield, which most people refer to as the benchmark treasury yield, is ultimately moving all these other interest rates higher. And we will do a deep dive on the mechanisms and how government spending or government deficits ultimately hurt your pocketbook in another episode of Everyday
I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks as always, Dr. O. That's Everyday Economics, part of the States, the Center Square's daily news magazine on YouTube and streaming across all platforms.
Welcome back to the States. I'm Jim Talamonte in for Greg Bishop. America is talking. Let's get to Medicaid fraud. This has drawn increased attention from the federal government and from taxpayers across the country. So we head to Greensboro, North Carolina. Medicaid reimbursed a business $1.7 million that prosecutors said was fraudulent. 55-year-old Gwendolyn Singleton, owner of Joel Center Hope in Greensboro, pleaded guilty in federal court. Prosecutors said Singleton executed the scheme through urine drug test claims between June 2021 and March 2023, using the name of a nurse practitioner and a doctor who said they did not provide the services. And if you look at the dollar amounts involved here, state appropriations in North Carolina for Medicaid increased 57% from 2021 to 2025, 57%, $3.93 billion to $6.17 billion, and state Medicaid expenditures rose 97% over that period of time. And federal Medicaid expenditures, again, we're talking taxpayer dollars here, rose more than 100%, 102.8%, from $12.33 billion to over $25 billion from fiscal years 2021 to 25. So that's the latest case in North Carolina. There are many of these around the country. Let's talk energy. Let's talk boundaries. Let's go to the Gulf Coast of the United States. A bipartisan coalition of lawmakers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana are pushing to change a 73-year-old law that limits their state's maritime boundaries to 3 miles offshore. So this could reshape the regulation of local fisheries and could generate billions of dollars in tax revenues from offshore energy and minerals leases. And anyone who's familiar at all with Gulf Coast states knows that offshore oil is a pretty big deal. The Offshore Parity Act would extend the state waters from 3 nautical miles out to 9. This would match the boundaries currently held by Texas and Florida. So this would give these Gulf states full economic control over new leases for traditional oil and gas drilling, also seabed mineral mining, and permanent offshore carbon sequestration. So this is something that is being proposed for, again, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, and there could be great benefits to the shrimping industry and the other fishing industries that are pretty important there in the Gulf. Let's head just a little bit to the west, to Texas. The Texas Health and Human Services Commission is cracking down on birth tourism. This is in response to a directive from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who directed state action to investigate one form of visa and immigration fraud, birth tourism, which he says will expand after the Supreme Court made its 14th Amendment ruling, as reported on at the Center Square. The court held that children born in the U.S. by mothers who are unlawfully in the country still have citizenship rights. So in Texas, the Health and Human Services Commission there has investigated birth tourism allegations and referred 2 facilities in particular to the Office of the Attorney General there. The 2 centers are apparently affiliated, according to this referral, with the Prime Healthcare Foundation. The website listed on a billboard, this was real, HaveMyBabyInTexas.com. That website appears to have been taken down, but an archived version was still available online. Governor Abbott's office encourages the public to report birth tourism advertising, and his government is clearly taking a more aggressive stance there. Let's go to the Midwest. And, well, really, this is a national story involving a lot of states, but in particular Michigan, where Attorney General Dana Nessel joined with 14 other attorneys general on a lawsuit attempting to stop the U.S. Department of Education from cutting funding to school-based mental health grants. This coalition, we're talking 15 states here, said these cuts are unlawful because the funding was already appropriated by Congress for these grants. And we've heard this in previous cases involving other federal funding issues. This is about $1 billion here that could be terminated by the end of July. Here are the states suing over this. In addition to Michigan, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Washington State, and Wisconsin. This was filed in Washington, Western District, Seattle. So those are some of the latest issues America's talking about. You can find out a whole lot more at thecentersquare.com. That's America's Talking on this Wednesday, July 15th. Again, much more on these stories and others impacting taxpayers at thecentersquare.com. So please like, share, subscribe on all your favorite platforms. Thanks for joining us today. Again, thanks to Sam and Eliana for getting the guest host through. I'm Jim Talamonte in for Greg Bishop today. There will be more tomorrow on The States, powered by the Center Square.